Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. It's week 21 and don't worry if you're new here, I will link a playlist at the top of the screen there so that you can go back and watch any of the videos in this series that you might have missed. We're making a quilt on a garden theme and we're making roughly one block a week, and later in the year we're going to put all our blocks together and learn more about the quilting process. Each piece works as a standalone piece of textile art, so if you don't fancy making a quilt, there are lots of ways that you can use the skills and techniques that we learn in these videos. This week I thought we would carry on with our scrap fabric zero waste ideas. So I'm using my grass print fabric here. I've got a 20 by 20 centimetre square for my backing, and we're going to make something along the lines of a garden path. Now I have gathered all of my little offcuts. I've been through my scraps bin again, and you can see that these are really quite tiny scraps, and I've just pulled out a selection that covers all of the different fabrics that I've been using across my quilt. And I've also pulled out some of my pattern fabrics. So I've got my ladybird print, and I've also got my bugs and flowers print that inspired the colour scheme, and we can actually draw some motifs from this for some of our little pieces. I've also got a bunch of these little hexies, and I've taken these from the pattern which I've made for this week's project, and you can find this pattern on our website. I'll put the address at the bottom of the screen, but I'll link it in the description below. It costs £1 to download. You could work this one out by yourself, but I have sized and composed the pattern for you so that that side of things is made really easy if you're not confident with sort of placement and composition. So all I've done is cut out the little hexagons, and you might need to print this twice because we'll be using it later to form the path. There's sort of two things happening in one here. If you want to do this by yourself, my hexagons are about 3 centimetres across on the flat side and about 3.4 from point to point, so you can easily run some of these up on the computer and print them out and cut them out. So I've just got a bunch of those. I've also got a heat erase pen that's going to show up on my backing fabric, and a pencil. I've got my embroidery scissors and paper scissors. I've got some pins handy and some machine threads, and one of my machine threads is a strong colour so that I can see it against my little bits of fabric. And then I've got my embroidery threads that I've been using throughout the project. So I've got my red, which is Anchor 046. I've got my yellow, which is 298. These are all Anchor brand. My light green, which is 255. My blue, which is 130. My pink, which is 025. And my white, which is 001. I have got my dark green there, but I don't think I'm going to use it. So you can tell already by the resources that we've got that we're going to do some English paper piecing here. This is a very popular technique, and hopefully I can show you some little tips and tricks along the way that avoid some of the pitfalls of this process. It's one of my favourite techniques to use and create almost foolproof results. So if you're new to patchwork, this is a really easy technique for you that by its very nature avoids some of the patchworking issues that you might face. So I've got a small piece of fabric and I want to make sure that I've got a border around the edge. So I'm just going to place my little paper hexagon onto my fabric and make sure that I've got around about a ½ centimetre or 1/4 inch border. And what I like to do is start off by stitching the paper to the fabric rather than the folding process. So I've just got some of my dark machine cotton here threaded up into a sharp needle, and I'm just going to roughly put a cross at the centre. Now I've got a quilter's knot in the end of this thread, and I've come up from the back so that the knot is on the surface on the right side, because we want easy access to these knots once we've stitched everything down. So now I just want to keep my thread out of the way. My paper is attached to my fabric, and I'm just going to trim around the outside of my paper, leaving about a ½ centimetre border on each side. And this doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just eyeballing it. You can just cut it roughly, because the paper is what's going to make this precise. Now, as always, I'm collecting up my scraps. They go into my scraps box, because we never know when they're going to come in handy. So now I'm going to find the side that is nearest to where my thread last came through the fabric. So it's this hole here, and what I want to do is fairly tightly fold the edge of the fabric, that overlap border that we've left. I want to fold that over the paper as far as it can go without affecting the shape of the paper. So I want to fold that really tightly down and then stitch through. So I've taken my needle through both the fabric and the paper. Now I'm at the corner. I want to just get my thumbnail in and create a little pleat there in the corner. So I'm folding the next side over, and I want to catch that in place by putting a little stitch over that pleat. So I've gone back through the paper and fabric, and then I've come back up and I'm stitching over that fold that I've just created. Now I want to stitch along the next side up to the next point where I need to make a little pleat. So this is just simple tacking stitches. I don't need to worry about what these look like, because they won't stay. And then I fold my corner over to make a little pleat and stitch over the top. And I just continue working around my hexagon in that way, making sure that my corners are really nice and sharp, and that I'm turning the fabric over my paper as closely as I possibly can, so that I've got really sharp edges, really neat finish, and really sharp points as well. And I just work all the way around my hexagon, trying to make my pleats all go in the same direction. Now, this might seem like an odd process to actually stitch our fabric to the paper, but the paper is effectively forming our shape for us and will hold our fabric in place until we've got it attached to our backing, and then the shape can't change at all. Now, on your last side, you can just fold it over like when you're wrapping a present, but I quite like my pleats to all go in the same direction. I think it might be in my head, but I think it gives a neater finish and makes your patchwork less lumpy. So I've folded that corner over in the same way that I've done all the others, and then I'm going to my last corner, which is very close to where I started, and I just want to manoeuvre that fabric so that the pleat is folding from left to right, just like all the other corners. And then I can go back round to where I started, making sure that last little bit is secured down to the paper again, and then I can finish off my thread with a quilter's knot. Snip off my thread, re-knot it, and that's my first little hexagon. You can see how sharp those corners are and how neat that finish is. So I'm going to put that to one side. Now, with patterned fabric, you can position your hexagon, your paper hexagon, to capture little motifs. So I've already got one that's got a ladybird on it. I want to capture that little daisy. So I'm just re-knotting my thread, and I'm going to get my paper former and just position it. I'm holding my fabric up there so that I can see through it a little bit. And I just want to position my paper so that my daisy, the motif that I want to capture, is nicely centred, and so that I've still got a border around the edge. And that really is the only thing to worry about when you're forming a hexagon that is capturing a motif, you just need to make sure that you've got enough fabric to allow you to have a border to turn around. And I'm just tacking it to the paper in exactly the same way. So it's just a case of thinking really carefully about where you're going to position your paper former and making sure you capture exactly what you're trying to capture on your hexagon. So that's my little daisy hexagon, and I've just made a bunch of them. These are really mindful things to do. You can just sit anywhere and form all these and just get as many as you need ready for the next stage. So now I've got all my hexagons, I want to start thinking about putting them together. So I've got here a sharps needle. I want a nice sharp pointed, fairly short needle, and I'm just using some ordinary machine cotton. I'm using Coats cotton here, and I've just threaded up some into my needle and knotted the end. And before I start sewing them together, I want to think about placement, because I want to balance these colours nicely across my block. So what I can do is just lay them on my pattern and test out some of the arrangements. Now, I'm roughly going colour by colour here, but you see that I get a little bit carried away and start doing whatever I liked. But I would recommend that you position each colour in turn across your piece, just to make sure that you've spread out each tone, and then you can think about patterns. So I picked up that yellow stripe and thought it was too pale, but then realised that I was going to have two polka dot pieces together, so I've gone back to the striped piece, and I'm just sort of laying them all out, thinking about the direction of the stripes, thinking about the arrangement that I'm creating, and making sure that the colours are scattered across the piece. And then I can just do a little bit of rearranging at the end if I end up with two similar blocks together or too much of one colour in one place. So now I can just slide that pattern across and keep it there so that I have got my arrangement. I haven't got to memorise anything. So I've got my first two pieces here, and I want to put them together with the right sides facing. I've got my knot in the end of my needle, and you might be able to see here that these two pieces are not quite the same width, but it will all correct itself in the end, so don't worry if your pieces don't quite match up. I'm just sliding my needle through the very corner just under the pleat on the hexagon that's facing me, and I'm bringing it out in the same place on the blue hexagon. So these are right sides together, and I want to just catch the fabric so you can kind of feel where the space under the fabric where it's folded over the paper, and you can see that I'm just catching just a couple of threads of the weave of the fabric. I'm not stitching through the paper here, and I'm just using a whip stitch, so I'm always going through from yellow side to blue side, moving along a little way and pulling through. And this is going to create really tiny stitches that are going to be barely visible when we open this out. So I'm trying to keep my stitches fairly even. These are about 1/16 of an inch, just a couple of millimetres apart, and I'm trying really hard to not catch the paper because it will make it harder to remove the paper at the end. So just catching those couple of threads of the fabric and stitching through, and when I get to the end of my side, I can just finish off my thread with a knot. I'm just stitching through one of my stitches here just to make sure that I don't have a really bulky knot in the corner, just looping through, and then I can snip off my thread, And if I open these out, you'll be able to see that that stitching is barely visible. You can just about see it, but hardly. And those edges are really precise and neat. So now I'm going to place that back down on my pattern, just so that I can keep track of where I'm up to. And I'm going to bring in my third piece here. Now this is going to join in at 2 edges, and we do them one at a time. So I've got my first edge, I've folded it over, and I'm going to stitch along that first join in exactly the same way. So I'll go in at the corner and whip stitch along up to the corner that is in between the 2 blocks that I've already stitched, that yellow block and the blue block. So now I can open out and refold my fabric. So you can see my yellow hexagon there is folded across the middle, and that's going to make sure that my hexagons are really tightly packed together and there aren't holes at the middle. And I'm just being really careful there to make sure I've caught that internal corner really carefully so that I don't end up with a hole in between those 3 blocks. So now I've got 3 blocks together. So now I'm adding my next block, and you can see that there I just folded my pink block up over the ones that I'd already stitched, just to make sure I'm stitching the correct edge to my blocks that are already joined. And I just work my way down the path, joining all my blocks together until I've got a complete section like that. And I'm really happy with the way this looks. That's just looks magic. I love a little bit of English paper piecing. So I've got my ironing mat here, and what we want to do now is set all those pieces in place. So I've got my iron and I'm just pressing over the top, and you can see me working from right to left there, just smoothing out the fabric to the left as I go, just to make sure it's all sitting flat and I'm not catching any creases in. And what that does is set those creases around the edges of the fabric in place, so that when we take our paper out, they are going to be absolutely fixed in place and won't change shape. So now I want to attach this to my background. I've laid it down on my backing fabric and made sure that I'm happy with the positioning of it. I want it to be even top to bottom and left to right, and I'm just going in with a few pins, not too many, just to hold it in position where I want it to remain. And you can see I've got some overhang there because we're working in hexagons rather than partial hexagons. We'll fix that later. You don't need to worry about those for the time being. What we don't want to do is cut them too soon and end up with loads of frayed edges to handle. And it's a little bit puckered because I've hooked the fabric with my pin, but it will be okay. We're going to take out our pins as we go. So we're going to applique this down. So I've got my sewing and my machine cotton again, and I've brought my needle up through both the backing fabric and that blue hexagon, and again I'm just catching right at the very edge, so I'm trying not to catch the paper. So I've come up through 2 layers, tucked my needle right against the blue and gone back down through the fabric, just through the backing fabric. So I'm hooking a stitch over the edge to hold my garden path down to the background. And I'm just going to do very similar stitches to the whip stitch that I've just used to join all my little hexagons together. I'm going to just keep them about 2-3 mils apart and work my way along, stitching down along that top edge. So you can see me going slowly and carefully. I want this to be really nicely positioned, and I want to make sure that I'm smoothing out my path as I go. So you'll see me just pressing there with my thumb just to make sure the block is sitting flat against the fabric, and I'm using my fingers behind the fabric to push along to make sure everything's flat. So I'm going to stitch like this all along that top edge, and then we will come back and look at the next stage. You only want to stitch that top edge for the time being. So there I've stitched all the way along the top, and before we stitch down the bottom we are going to remove the paper. So this is why we kept our knots on the surface. I'm going to go in with my scissors. I'm just pinching the knots there and snipping them off, and then I can go in with my fingernails or the tip of my scissors. I sometimes do it with a needle or a pin, but I had a seam ripper nearby, so I can just get my seam ripper in, and you'll notice that I use the back of the seam ripper. I don't want to keep cutting the thread because I actually find it's really hard to get all the little bits out. So I like to try and keep my thread whole if I can, and literally just unstitch rather than cut every little stitch that I've made. It just makes getting all the bits out a total nightmare. So I'm just going to remove all of that black thread from all of the blocks, and I've just done a few here, and then once I've taken the black thread out I can go in with my seam ripper and just hook out the paper formers that we put in there. You can unfold the hexagons if you want to. Because we press them with an iron, those folds are going to be fixed in place, and so it'll be really easy to retuck the seams that you've created because of the ironing part of the process. That's why we press them. It can be quite tricky to get into those corners, but you can just fold the fabric over. And I don't throw my hexagons away. These will be reused. You can reuse them several times before they become unusable. So once you've cut out all those hexagons, don't just throw them in the bin, because you can use them again for another piece of paper piecing. So I've taken out all my black thread now and all of my papers, and now I'm just going to go along and stitch down the bottom edge of my garden path. So exactly the same process, smoothing out your applique as you go with your thumb on the top and your fingers behind, and just applique stitch along that edge to secure it firmly in place. Okay, so I've stitched down my garden path and I am absolutely loving the way this looks. There's something just so homely about English paper pieced hexagons. What we're going to do now is add some over stitching, and I'm going to use a reduction method here because it's going to be really hard. We've got multiple layers of fabric now. It's going to be really hard to trace this path through all those layers. So what I'm going to do is just cut out that path. Now this is why I say it would be useful to print 2 of these, because you might have already cut out your hexagons. I've cut along the top and bottom of the path, and I'm just positioning it now on top of my little hexagon arrangement, and I'm using those margins at the side to line up the path to make sure it's central. And now I can just go in with my heat erase pen and just sketch along the edges of that path, and this is going to guide me with my over stitching. So I'm just going all the way along the top and then along the bottom, and you'll notice I changed colour because I noticed that I couldn't see the pink very well on the red. So just choose a pen that you're going to be able to see. I'm going to keep this really simple, and what I'm going to do is some canther embroidery. So this is just simple running stitch. We're going to try and line up lines of running stitch though, and it will create this sort of lovely quilted puckery texture on the surface of our path. So I've got 2 strands of my red embroidery thread here, and I'm just going to stitch along that first pen line that I've just made with that red. I'm going to do 2 lines of each colour. You could do more if you wanted to, but I didn't want to totally overwhelm all that patchwork that we've worked so hard to create. So I want plenty of the patchwork showing through. So my stitches are maybe 1/2 centimetre long, 1/4 of an inch, something like that. And as I've said many times before, I really like the look of running stitch when the spaces between the stitches are smaller than the stitches themselves. I think it looks much more professional and much more stylish. So I've got my 2 lines of red there, and now I've got 2 strands of pink thread, and I'm going along the bottom edge of the path and putting 2 lines of that in. So now I want to position something in the middle, so I'm going to cut my pattern in half here. So I'm eyeballing this, cutting along the middle of my path to create a new shape to draw along. So this is what we mean by the reduction method. We're just taking away bits of the pattern that we don't want to use. So now I can position my new pattern piece on the surface, and this is going to give me my centre line. So again, I'm going to go along with my heat erase pen and draw in that line, and that's going to guide my stitching. Now I've got 2 strands of green thread, and I'm going to do exactly the same process again. I'm going either side of the line this time rather than stitching on it. So I'm going to go along with my green, and then I came back and stitched 2 lines of yellow in between the red and the green, and 2 lines of blue in between the green and the pink, and it's formed a kind of rainbow, a sort of loose rainbow arrangement, and I just love it. I was so happy with the way this block turned out. I don't always feel that, but I think it's the combination of the stitching and the paper piecing that just makes me really happy. So there we've got our garden path with our cantha embroidery and our English paper piecing. I think this is a lovely little addition to the quilt. I hope you've enjoyed making that. Do share your blocks at #FSH23quilt. That way we can see all of our work all together. And if you have enjoyed this, do give us a like. It really makes our day. It helps other people find these videos as well. Just a little bit of a close-up. I couldn't stop looking at it. If you've enjoyed this project and you want something similar, I will link some videos over here. And if you would like to see more content like this, please do subscribe. We post videos every week. You can just click our logo down here. It makes it really easy for you. So that's it for this week. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great week making your garden path block, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.